let's have a look at your research, an expert roundtable discussion on intersectionality and autism and adulthood. So one of the points is more diverse representation in studies in leadership. How pressing do you think that is?
I think it's pretty pressing because I feel like, I think on the studies side, I think there's, especially as I'm starting to read, even across the age range of like, there's a lot on children, there's some stuff on adults, and then there's like not very much on older adults, which is like kind of freaky as somebody who hopes to eventually become an older adult. So, and I think, but I think also just in terms of like demographic diversity and in terms of the type of research that's been done, I think that we have kind of a general idea of like some things that are going on in autism, but I feel like there's so many specific situations that people are in, and some things that might differ for different subgroups of people, or just people who are being left out of the research process, I feel like is important. And I think on the leadership side, like that kind of a similar thing. I think if there's, on the bit of the kind of bottom up in studies, but then also the top down a bit on leadership of kind of, I think it shows what types of research and perspectives fields find valuable.
And this might be because I'm autistic, but my original stance on science, or my idea of it, was that if you're a scientist, it doesn't matter whether you're autistic or not if you're studying autism, because you're a scientist. You do it by the rules of science, so the result should be the same, right? But then there was, for instance, the recent, that is not my position anymore. There was the recent interview with Uta Frith, which left me a bit shocked, to be honest, because some of the things she said were so dismissive of lived experience in autistic people that I was thinking, like, how can you be a leading figure in autism research for like 60 years or however she's in that field and be so dismissive of the people that you're studying? That was amazing. That felt amazing to me. The way she was talking about headphones. So we're talking about a group of people where we know they have less filters for the input that comes from the outside. And then they use a device as a filter so that they get less input, because we also know that when they get too much input, they wear out. But you're going to be like, no, I don't know if that's going to help. I can't really say. I have to do my science first. Like, that felt so... And if that is that is the kind of attitude that is prevalent amongst autism researchers, then we're going to need some autistic people in there.
It was nice that I went to my first INSAR, the International Society for Autism Research Conference.
Wait, say that recently. Again, please.
INSAR, International Society for Autism Research, last week. And it was, and I think they've likely come a long way from before I got involved, but like, it was nice that there was kind of a sense of there's not assuming that autistic people weren't there in the room also doing research, or also like kind of reading about or hearing about what they were talking about. So I think things are slowly coming along, but then also really disappointing interviews, and you're like, okay, well, maybe not.
In the when I read about the paper, the roundtable discussion, one term that popped up to me was identity affirming approaches, and I think that is a point of contention for in the current discussion about neurodiversity. So please explain to me, what does identity affirming approach mean to you, and what does it mean in context of your work?
I think for me, basically it means like, one, not viewing autism as a terrible thing. And then also two, I think focusing on like what is actually bothering the person, rather than like focusing on particular like thoughts or expectations about how people should be or should act, when it's like, if that's not bothering them, then like whatever. Yeah.
Okay, I can get fully on board on that, because that would be a perfect lever to get ABA out of the room. Not a big fan of ABA therapy.
Yeah, I think, a lot of that has been, focused a lot on what, like, beliefs about how people should be acting, when it's like,
make the autistic person look normal, so we don't have to bother with all the weirdness anymore.
Yeah, so I'd say that is not identified affirming.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The reason that the term makes me somewhat weary is from what I've seen in trans affirming approach, where they took it as far as, we're going to have minors decide we're going to let them decide over operations that will make them infertile for the rest of their life, where they're going to lose body parts and so on. So I thought that took it way too far. But the whole thing, like here in let's say in the closer vicinity, here it's a lot. In Germany, for instance, it's a problem. You get a diagnosis from one doctor, you get the autism diagnosis, then you go to a different doctor, and maybe the reason you're going to that doctor doesn't even have anything to do with the autism, but you mention that you have autism because that seems to play a part in patient-doctor relationships. I don't know if that has ever been a point of research for you, but maybe you've come across the research of other people. It seems to be that autistic people tend to rub doctors the wrong way, or that they get confused when they don't get enough information from the doctor. And so it seems like a good idea to mention that you're autistic, but then the doctor might be like, no, you're not autistic. So I suppose that would be really annoying.
Yeah, I know there's been some research from I know their acronym is ASPIRE, but like about like kind of healthcare toolkits of like trying to figure out, that doctor-patient communication, especially with respect to autism. I don't know much about that in detail, but I think, sometimes people might be like, different medical providers might be like, like skeptical of other people's diagnoses, or the opposite of like kind of diagnostic overshadowing, or it's like all your problems are just the autism, and anything else you say is probably just the autism. So kind of the opposite.
Yeah, that is annoying as well. I went to a doctor once and with back problems, and he was like, no, you don't have back problems. You just feel these things more intensely because you're autistic. That wasn't helpful at all.
That you feel your back, that the same conclusion is you're feeling back problems.
Yeah. Okay, so can you give me a short synopsis of the outcome of that roundtable discussion?
So I was actually not, sorry, now my cat is biting me, not necessarily a critical part of this roundtable discussion. I feel like it was drawing more on kind of both work that I've done and work that other people have done in the field related to intersectionality. So I am not sure what the outcome was. I think the outcome was kind of adding to the pile of like evidence of like, we need to think about these things more. But yeah, I'd be interested because that was a few years ago. So it'd be cool if they did an update or like a round two.
But one of the things was that autistic people should be involved more in the definition of, in the research about, in the definition of autism. It is what I picked up from the paper.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think that's starting, it's been growing in, I think, prevalence in terms of how much like autistic people have been more involved as kind of the core research team, or also as like kind of people who aren't researchers who are involved in the research. So I think that's been cool to see.
Is that also your takeaway from the Autism Europe conference?
Yeah, I think Autism Europe was nice in terms of, I think it did a nice job of having both like the kind of like traditional researcher perspective and the kind of like applications in the community, and also kind of like one of the presentations that our team did had to included that they set the study up before I got involved, but they set it up very well, of like having people who weren't researchers but were autistic kind of trained up a little bit in some of the research methods and kind of giving their perspectives and being really involved, which I like, because I think it is important to have autistic researchers, but I also think like I think I've like, for me specifically, like I have a very unique, I guess, like educational path that like most autistic people aren't necessarily going into research, but their like views are still very important. And I feel like I can't speak for all autistic people, and neither necessarily can they, but it's better than just me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I really liked the Autism Europe conference. As I am, the Autism Charity of Ireland will from now on be my bookmark, not bookmark, benchmark in regards to autism organizations. They're headed by someone who has autism. I think more than 50% of their staff are actually autistic. So them being the local partner of Autism Europe to do the conference, that was great. But then the conference itself, I mean, I'm a complete nobody. I didn't finish school. I finished school, but I didn't finish any of my studies. All I got is my lived experience and the practical experience from working with autistic people. And I got to do a poster presentation there, just for being autistic. And it's one of the most prominent autism conferences in the world, as far as I can tell. So that is a pretty good standard, in my opinion. Then a lot of the major speakers were more autistic people, and I don't have any numbers, but it felt to me like when going through the halls, it felt like somewhere a third or maybe half of the people had some neurodiverse background as well. So that felt really good.
Yeah, it was nice.
Okay, let's have a look at Endorsement of the Neurodiversity Framework and Self-Esteem among Autistic and Non-Autistic Adults. So this is a survey study that she did. And it came to the conclusion that people who endorse the neurodiversity framework tend to have a better self-image, higher self-esteem, somewhat more shielded against stigma and low self-worth. And so, could you explain to me what the neurodiversity framework is?
Yeah.
In the context of this?
In the context of this paper, it was using a survey scale that I developed that's looking at the neurodiversity framework. It ended up being kind of like, based on the statistics, that kind of ended up grouping these different statements into categories. The main categories had to do with like stigmatizing views towards autism. So basically the opposite of that. So neurodiversity movement being non-stigmatizing views towards autism. Another main category had to do with viewing autism as either neutral or positive difference rather than a deficit. And then the third category was viewing autism as a permanent condition that can't be changed or cured. I think the neurodiversity movement is framework and also is like more than just autism, and also is more than these three categories of things. But I think in terms of this study, I feel like it was at least a nice start of kind of thinking about how people are thinking about autism and how that might be related to self-esteem, especially in autistic people. But yes, for this study, the thing that was related to self-esteem for autistic people, but not for non-autistic people, is viewing autism as a difference rather than a deficit, which makes sense. So yeah, I feel like it's kind of one of those things that feels a bit intuitive, but it was cool to see with the data.
Yeah, that makes sense to me as well. And I didn't have a familiar experience with all of the diagnoses that I got before, but maybe that was also because they didn't really feel accurate. But I think, I I never got no, I did. I think. Doctors are weird sometimes. But I think I got the borderline diagnosis, if I can remember correctly. It was not just suggested. And if you look at that diagnosis, that feels like more like a spell that you cast on an enemy. Because, if you read through that, if you believe that that is what you are, like, how are you going to live with that self-image?
Yeah, I think especially borderline is an interesting one because it's very stigmatized. I think especially in like therapy communities, but then also if you read through the things, you're like, oh, am I that?
It's definitely stigmatized in the sense that it's harder for them to find therapeutic personnel that will work with them. But it even goes in the other direction where therapeutic personnel will not use the term. They will make up some diagnosis that doesn't exist, or they will give another diagnosis to avoid the negative associations that come with the diagnosis. So, yeah, it makes sense that if you frame things positively and give people hope through the way you define them, that it might work for them better.
And even not necessarily, it doesn't even have to be positive. It just has to be like not bad.
It'll have to. it'll have to give room for you to do something about it. Like if it tells you you're going to end up in a bad place no matter what you do, that's not going to be helpful. And then another work of yours is examining the associations between endorsement of disability models and system justification within disabled and non-disabled individuals. Could you give us a short summary of what that paper was about?
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about the social medical models of disability, of kind of viewing the social model was sort of viewing the disability experience as related to your experience in society, and the medical model being a bit more within one's own individual body. So system justification basically has to do with kind of how much people are okay with the status quo, which is kind of an interesting like political psychology world. And I feel like I keep being drawn to bits and pieces from different fields and bringing them together. So there's a kind of there's the disability world, there's the political psychology world, and these feel like kind of intuitively related because a lot of the disability world's related to like disability political movements. So anyways, it's looking at if we think about the models of disability, generally the medical model is a bit more of like what the traditional status quo is of how people traditionally have thought about disability in recent years. So I was wanting to look at, is this related to justifying existing systems in general? And also, does this depend on lived experience of disability? And basically found that generally, yeah, if you've system justifying beliefs, you're more likely to agree with the medical model and disagree with the social model. And then, and I'm like, I always want to double check that I don't want to say it wrong. But for people without disabilities, greater systems just, I feel like I'm looking at this graph and I'm like trying to explain this graph because I feel like the graph explains it better. But basically, I'll explain the graph. We've got two lines on the graph.
Yeah.
And there's also 2 points on the graph, and the graph's looking at like people who don't agree with the social model very much versus people who agree with the social model a lot. So low social model and high social model. And then on the y-axis is systems justification. So basically, the higher it is, the more they kind of generally tend to agree with the status quo systems in society. And then there's two lines on the graph, one for people without disabilities and one for people with disabilities. And basically for having a disability, the line is like generally pretty flat of your level of how much you agree with the social model isn't really related to how you feel about justifying current systems. But if you do not have a disability, having not endorsing the social model very much is related to more system justification. So I feel like this is.
Yeah, it breaks it down.
I went into the weeds a bit, but yeah.
No, that makes totally sense because, I mean, if you're not disabled, then you don't know about the social implications unless maybe your partner is disabled or you're friends with someone who has a disability who will give you some insights on it. But yeah, I thought I'd expect for a normie, no disability, they'd probably look at disability as something out of a textbook, but not necessarily understand the lived experience that goes along with it. And that is something like that resonates with my experience with people. So when you meet people who, for instance, have a disabled sibling, their attitude towards disability is so dramatically different.
Yeah. And I was also, I think you had asked a question over email about the other paper about neurodiversity and self-esteem, and wondering like how that relates to like kind of connection to the autistic community. And I was looking at the data, and it was because I did collect information about like, do you know other autistic people? And generally, yeah, people who didn't know any autistic people at all had more stigmatizing views of autism. So kind of like this very abstract concept of autism that kind of mapped onto some of the stereotypes that may or may not be acceptable in our society. But also, like, only one autistic person in that study didn't know any autistic people. So this is generally among non-autistic people. But yeah, I think having this more personal experience with disability or autism, I think, gives people more nuanced views.
It reminds me of a documentary that I looked into recently. It was about an autistic woman living in Germany, and her demeanor felt to me like she was very much focused on fitting in. And it's just, this might just be my projection, but it felt to me as if she didn't like it when she couldn't do things in a proper way, or she had an assistant, and it just seemed to me that there was some internalized ableism.
Yeah.
I don't that'd be the shortest way to point it out, like that she kind of looked down on herself for not being able to do all the things, and you know, like looking down at herself for having deficits in certain areas. And yeah, so I try to not do that. Like sometimes it comes easy to me, sometimes I have to actively work for that, but I try to really not, like, I know that I have some deficits if you compare me to a neurotypical person, if they exist. Yeah, that is an interesting sentence. When someone said to me recently, what the thing that someone said to me was, the set of neurotypical people is an empty set. That is something that someone said to me recently. And before the person said that to me, I was quite comfortable using the term neurotypical. I'm not so comfortable anymore now. Yeah. I still use the term in my seminars when I explain to people about autism and not autism. I mean, you gotta explain it somehow. But then, yeah, the term, the sentence, the statement that the neurotypical set is an empty set might be a true statement. I still have to think about that stuff. But anyways, so we were at the system justification and disability models, and yeah, I have one more of your papers on my list, and that's the public perceptions of the neurodiversity movement. And yeah, can you give us a short synopsis of what that paper was about?
Basically, it was about, it's sort of the opposite side of my paper where I made that scale about like, if you agree with these items, you agree with the neurodiversity movement. It's the opposite of asking people what they thought the goals of the neurodiversity movement are and how they felt about it. Because it's one of those words that, especially nowadays, gets used a lot. And it seems to me people mean slightly different things by it. So this was looking at how people answer that question.
And what did you find out?
Generally, people kind of like grouped around the same ideas. They weren't necessarily all saying all the ideas in their definitions, but in general, people had kind of like a positive view of the neurodiversity framework, like if they had heard of it, because this only had people who had heard of it. So I think in general, yeah, people viewed it as something that's advocating for rights of neurodivergent people. Often they kind of mention autism or ADHD, and kind of viewing neurodiversity as a form of diversity that should be accepted. That was kind of the broad view. People had different kind of specific iterations. And then there's also kind of people who were a bit more skeptical about the movement or disagreed with it, who generally their critiques had to do with, I think, worrying that it didn't really take into account people who are really impaired by their disabilities or their carers, or kind of worrying that it's like too extreme.
Yeah, I think that brings us right to the focal point of discussion at the moment. Yeah. My impression is that like there's several ideas that come to mind when I think about the neurodiversity movement. So the idea of a political movement that will kind of, in a sense, like the gay rights movement. Before the gay rights movement, there wasn't a lot of gay rights. There were rights for heterosexual people. And there might even be laws that would criminalize homosexual people, depending on what country you were in. So in Germany, for instance, in the 1950s, you could officially still go to prison for being a homosexual. It was rare that it happened. But then we look at the very sad example of Alan Turing, who is a war hero that helped defeat the Nazis and also the inventor of the modern computer. And he was, after the war, chemically castrated, which was a punishment because he had been caught, I don't know, not in the act of intercourse as far as I know, but having associations with a person of the wrong gender. And that eventually drove him to suicide. So, and if the neurodiversity movement were capable of extending the civil liberties and civil rights of people in the same sense that the gay rights movement did for gay people, that the lesbian rights movement did for lesbians, black rights movement did for black people, and so on, that'd be cool. I'd be up for that. And the fields that I think would be important would have a lot to do with education and the work environment. I think that would be things where we might need additional jurisdiction and so on. But then there is a fear, because I think we got to put it into a bit of a context. I mean, there's the wokies, and from the way I have talked about them, one might have picked up on the fact that me personally, I'm not too big of a fan of the whole wokeness thing, and it feels to me like they went from group to group. So they start from the idea of wokeism starts out in the Black rights movement, but I would argue that whatever started out in the 40s or 60s or wherever you want to put it in the Black rights movement, I'd say we have a new form of wokeness that started out somewhere in 2010, or started to become big and meaningful somewhere in 2010. And they went into all the civil liberties movements and groups, and some of them got prominent there. And I think the trans movement actually caught it the worst, in the sense that you have very public figures that hold very extreme, very fringe positions that don't necessarily have a lot to do with the lived reality of non-famous trans people. And I think we're seeing something similar in the way that it's happening with the neurodiversity movement, where you have some representatives who are very privileged in the sense that they can have an autonomous life, that they maybe have a prosperous career. And they talk about autism in ways where, for instance, a family that has 2 children with early childhood autism, in the way we would frame it before we talked about a spectrum, where the whole family is in a crisis because of the needs of their children, that they don't really see themselves represented in the way that the more privileged part of the autism spectrum speaks about autism. Do you think that's a proper way to sum it up?
Yeah, I feel like there's a few different things going on. Like, I think sometimes people can take their individual experience of autism and then think that applies to everybody's experience of autism. And I think there's also historically been like a lot of tension between the kind of autistic adult community and then the like parents of autistic children in terms of competing priorities, when I think in ideal circumstances, both those priorities are like included in what I would view as the neurodiversity framework. But I think there's the actual implementation of that is a bit trickier. And then I think there's a question of like potentially like kind of co-opting terminology that's related to neurodiversity, but just having the same kind of stigmatizing attitudes about disability and autism. So yeah, I feel like there's a lot of stuff going on that happens, I think, in many social movements as they become more popular. But I think specifically to autism, it's kind of this historical tension plus the autism is like such a wide range of experiences that I think sometimes if you feel a very strong identification with autism, the concept, it can be hard to view other people's experience that are different as like also kind of connected to your own in a way. So I think from my perspective, like I don't think the issue is necessarily about like being too woke, but it's more about like I think just having preconceived notions and lack of openness to other perspectives at times when these could be like people who could be like allies and like kind of help further your cause, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. You're too nice and interviewing.
I also like, I feel like I have this idealistic vision of like what the neurodiversity movement should be. Yeah.
No, wait. Don't even feel the need to justify yourself to that statement I just made. My problem with this is I was hoping for something more, that would rub me in a way that I could pick up on it, but you said it so nicely and like involving everybody, and like it's hard to criticize it in the way that you put it. or not necessarily criticize, but pick up on further things. Yeah, I feel really very alienated in a way. Like, so originally I thought the idea of the neurodiversity movement, great idea. Because I think, as I said before, civil liberties, civil rights, there needs to be some extension for neurodiversity, in my opinion. And recently on social media, I've been flooded with content that is just in different ways. Some of it I disagree with, some of it actually makes me uncomfortable. Because it's so far away from my own personal experience of autism, from my experience with self-help groups and, being part of the autism community. I don't even like to use the term because I think it doesn't make that much sense. But, being someone who themselves is finding out about autism and therefore relying on people who were there before, who can tell you something. But then also working with autistic people myself now. I just feel so alienated by a lot of the things that are written. So I'll give you an example. I don't agree with what Robert Kennedy had to say on autism. And what's the name of the medication he mentioned? I only have that German name.
Oh, the paracetamol
right now.
During pregnancy. Yeah.
Yeah. Lysonol. What's the name again?
Oh,
in the US.
Is this what he's talking about? The painkiller during pregnancy? Yeah. Paracetamol is the.
Yeah. Genau. Paracetamol. That would be the German way of saying it, but there was another name he used. But
it may have been the brand name.
Yeah. Anyways, so I don't agree with what he said and the way he framed it. And I don't like that he listens to that person that he listens to. But one of the things he said, that there's autistic children who will never pay taxes. And then everybody made fun of that. But I have worked with children like that. They will never pay taxes. They will never be able to hold a job in the first work market. Never. They won't be able to do it. They will probably have to live the rest of their lives in a home where other adults make sure that they have everything that they need, because they will not be able to provide themselves with that. And it bothers me so much when people take the opposite stance to a Robert Kennedy just out of spite, just showing like, I'm really against that. Yes, we got it. You're against that, which is justified, but maybe not to the extremity that you're doing it. Like things like that just make me weary of where it's going. And then I have always been in left wing and in alternative spaces, and I've seen how toxic things can get around the gender discussion, for instance, where I've worked in an anarchist center, and there were discussions about women's quotas, feminism, stuff like that, and it led to half of or even more than half of the active people just going away. There was a fight between two groups, there was a split, and half of the active people just vanished. And it would have almost taken out that center. And so I see all the destruction in structures and groups that can be caused by these divisive ideas. And that's something I worry about in regards to the neurodiversity movement and to the part that the wokies play in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, and I was thinking about the like RFK like thing. I think there was the initial reaction of like, plenty of autistic people do work and pay taxes and do all that, and like the kind of just but then there
I really like the meme.
But then there's like people being like, well, even if you can't do that, you're still a valuable human being, like, which should be the message, and they also deserve rights. But then I think there's the kind of like, then there's a part of the internet can be a very toxic place. And then like, I feel like leftist infighting is like not necessarily productive of then I think there's kind of arguments about how to perfectly do something when then you just have somebody like RFK in power who's like saying nonsense, like when we could be working together, even if there's like a bit of is not necessarily agreeing on everything or not necessarily being the most smooth. But I feel like that's easier said than done because it's so high stakes of like feeling like people's rights are on the line after historically being treated very badly. So it's hard to not fall into that. And I feel like being connected with people outside of the internet has helped me be, I think, like a bit less rigid about, like, sometimes I see people online being like, immediately tear somebody down if they use person first language, when it's like, I mean, I do prefer identity first language, but like,
I always get confused with that.
Person with autism is
identity first is person with autism, and
other way around.
No, the other way around.
Autistic person is identity first.
Okay, autistic person, and if you say autist instead, that would be
autist is more niche. That I feel like people have.
What's the alternative to saying autistic person
with autism?
Saying person with autism. Oh yeah, okay. No.
But like, I think like those vocabulary choices are important and do convey like people's values to a certain extent, but also I think you shouldn't dismiss what a person has to say, even if they're not using the type of vocabulary that you find that you prefer.
That is a thing that I very negatively correlate with wokeness, to put it in scientific terms.
I don't have. I'm not quite sure how you define wokeness, but of like what it is.
It's true. I do owe you a definition. So that which you just mentioned, these mob tactics. Oh, he used the wrong language. Let's bring him down. That is a sort of tactic that I associate with that. And when I started going to self-help groups, started being part of autism, that just wasn't there. The discussion about person or identity first, that just didn't happen. That is something we didn't do in the autistic space, at least in the spaces that I visited. And that was more something that we looked on with a bit of bewilderment in terms of other disabilities, because there's also, are you a disabled person or are you a person with a disability? That whole thing. That whole thing existed in the German language space as well. But in autistic spaces, it was more like, yeah, some say it like that, some say it like that, and we accept them all. It's only now that it starts becoming such a point of contention. And sometimes I wonder how much of that is actually real and how much of that is a performance that people put on or feel like they need to put on because they're doing it on the internet.
Yeah.
It's something I've noticed that when I used the internet in the 90s, it was pretty common in discussion forums that you would have a meaningful exchange. Be it on technical aspects of a hobby, or be it in a philosophical discussion. And I feel like that has very much vanished. I feel like 80 to 90% of the interactions I have online, they don't feel genuine anymore. Someone asks a question, but they don't care about your answer. They just care that you put an answer, so the counter of answers that they got goes up by one. They don't care at all about what you answer. Or you try to have a discussion, you try to have an exchange, and people just want to be right. They just want to win.
Yeah.
They don't want to pick up a new idea. They don't want to explain their idea to you. They just want to make themselves look good, make you look bad in the process. Things like that. And so I'm thinking how much of that is actually real and how much is due to the internet being the internet.
Yeah. And I think, and also now I'm all like paranoid because I'm like, oh, now it's like, are these even real people talking, or is this all just AIs talking to each other? But yeah,
that as well.
But yeah, it's easy. Yeah, something about the internet is, something about it like draws this inclination in people sometimes, which is interesting because the neurodiversity movement like kind of originated in internet spaces